Welcome back, everybody. Sean here once again with another video, Sovereign Man I Am. This video is going to be focused mainly on banking, and the title is Banking and the Scam of Modern Currency Creation. And I will try to keep it as simple and as short as I possibly can. Of course, they like to complicate it and make it seem very hard to understand, but really, if you look at it, it's really not that simple at all. But the mechanisms that they have in place, and this applies to all countries in the Western world at least, allows them to essentially create money out of thin air through what they call, there's a couple of different mechanisms, but the one where they create most of the currency they call fractional reserve lending or fractional reserve banking. So just to start off and give you some numbers, as far as national debt, I looked them up. We have, of course, the United States at $21.5 trillion right now. We have the United Kingdom at $2 trillion in debt. We have Canada, which just topped $1 trillion. It's the first time they actually reached $1 trillion in debt. It's a milestone. And then we have Australia trailing, which has the lowest national debt, but still, it's $350 billion. So just keep that in mind. The government, essentially, when they need money, what they do is they issue treasury bonds, which treasury bonds are then bought by banks, and they each come bearing interest. So the government needs money, they'll issue bonds, which will be bought either by a middleman bank and then sold to the central bank, or bought directly by the central bank. In either case, they're bought at interest. The interest, of course, is basically put on the back of the citizens. It's the citizens who are responsible for paying back the interest on the national debt. So that's how money is first created, generally speaking, in a country. And it's actually only about 5 to 10% of the currency created. But nonetheless, it comes with debt. Now, once the money has been created and the central bank has issued currency to the government, realize that the currency that the central banks are issuing to the government are created out of thin air. They're just either numbers in a computer screen. Obviously, they're not printing money to give to the government, so it's really just numbers on a computer screen, which are fictitious and based on nothing, and then issued to the government to then spend. Unfortunately, instead of printing its own money, the government in all four of these countries that I mentioned are going through a central bank, issuing bonds again. So all the money that is created in the beginning is created right away with interest. Once the money is then issued to the government, of course, the government will spend it on public works and its employees and its infrastructure. That money then becomes spent through its employees and through its contractors, and it is actually given to them and then deposited into their banks. Okay, now this is where most of the money in our system is actually created. It's created through the private banks, and that's where we get the term fractional reserve lending. Once the money is deposited, and I'm going to try to keep the numbers very simple, and like I said, it's actually a very simple concept, but it's mind-blowing when you understand it. The money, if we look at just $1,000 deposited into a bank, a private bank, once the money, $1,000, is deposited into a bank, by law, the bank only has to keep a maximum of 10%. In some cases, it's actually less than 10% on hand, and then they're able to lend the rest of the money. So for the sake of numbers and the sake of simplicity, we'll stick with 10%. And again, we'll look at the same $1,000. So $1,000 is deposited by either one of these contractors or a government employee into the bank. The bank then only has to keep $100, and they're then able to lend at interest $900 of that $1,000 deposit. However, because they have now lent out 900 of the 1,000, they need to balance their books, and they essentially create bank notes to cover the 900 that they've now lent. So from $1,000, they're able to lend now $900 at interest to somebody else who wants to buy a car or a house or some other item that they're taking a loan for. And they create the 900 in the form of bank notes, which they keep to balance their books at the end of the year. So right there from $1,000, now they've created 1,900. The 900 that they lent out, of course, they're lending out at interest. They never lend out money for free. Now, once somebody decides to borrow that money from the bank, again, it's for a house or a car or some, renovations on their home, something like that that they're using it for. So they take that money, and of course, they're going to give it to either their contractors, the car dealership, or another bank to buy their house. But in either case, the person that's taking the $900 from them is going to then go and deposit it into their bank. So then we have $900. The bank again only needs to keep 90. And this is again a maximum. Generally speaking, well, not generally speaking, it usually is around 10, but there are some cases where it goes as low as 3% they only have to keep on hand. So from there, they have 900, they can lend out 810. This is now the second bank. Now, again, because they've lent out 810, they need to balance their books at the end of the year. They create bank notes for that 810 that they've lent. And don't forget, the 810 that they've lent and the 900 that was lent before that is all interest-bearing loans. So right from there, that's another 1710 that the second bank will have created. And if we take this down the line, and I've only calculated 5 banks deep, 5 transactions deep, from $1,000 that was deposited into a private bank, after only 5 transactions, just working with 10%, which again, it's not always 10%, but just using 10%, out of $1,000, $7,780 is now created. So, I mean, the $1,000, we can count it in there, so we can say it's $6,780 was created out of thin air, out of the $1,000. So don't forget that the original money that was created through bonds, that was issued through the government, which are interest-bearing, and then paid for by the central bank made that money up out of thin air. It's numbers on a computer screen. And then if we look at the private banks, once the money is deposited, because of fractional reserve lending, and this applies to all 4 countries I mentioned, by the way, just from that $1,000, it becomes almost $8,000. Out of thin air, they've now created, just the private banks, $6,780. Now the kicker to all this, which already that's enough, I mean, again, all this money, which we're working for, you know, blood, sweat, tears, toil, effort, and creativity to earn some of this currency, the banks, whether it be the central bank or the private banks, are creating out of thin air. These are numbers on a computer screen. Nonetheless, it is currency that's in our GDP, if you will, our country's currency. So every time another transaction takes place and more money is created, of course, the money that's already in the money supply in the country is diminished in value, which is inflation. So not only are they creating the money out of thin air that we're working for, but every time they create more money, the money that we've already worked for, that we have in our pockets or our banks, becomes worth less. And that's why we have generally the average of inflation is around 4%. So not only are they, again, they have a license to print money, they create it out of thin air, but every time they do create the money out of thin air, the money that we have in our money supply in our country is diminished in value. Now on top of all of this, which again is enough to rile you up for sure, on top of all this, every single dollar that was created, whether it be through the central bank or through the private banks, was all created in the form of loans, interest-bearing loans. Now the problem with economies, and the reason why we see these huge debts in each one of these countries, is that the money that's created is the loan itself. They never actually create the interest on the loan. So the money in our money supply, even if it was to be entirely paid back on all the loans that are outstanding right now, there would not be enough money in the money supply to cover all the debt, because the interest on the debt has never been created. It does not exist. So the only way, even if we paid back every single dollar owed privately and publicly to the banks, the only way then to cover the interest, which has never been created, would be to borrow again. And that's why the entire system, the entire financial system, is built on debt. And they talk about lowering the debt ceiling, lowering the national debt, and so forth. It's an actual impossibility. Now the reason I'm saying this is if you actually look at it and project forward, the entire system is built on debt. There is not another dollar that's created unless it is interest-bearing and a loan, which is debt. So the debt of each one of these countries is going to continue to rise, and at a certain point, there is no other mathematical option but for the entire system to implode. How high can the debt go? I mean, $21.5 trillion in the States is a pretty substantial number. I remember, you know, when we were talking 13, 14 trillion, and they were saying putting a debt ceiling, and there was a whole bunch of drama around that. Of course, they had to raise the debt ceiling because there's no other option. There's no way to actually pay back the loan plus the interest without taking out another loan bearing interest. So the entire system is built on debt. It'll continue to be built on debt, and at a certain point, of course, it will come toppling down. Okay? Now the reason I'm telling you all this is not, again, as we've said in previous videos, it's not to anger you or to scare you, but to make you aware of the system that we're working within so that you can protect yourself and that you can start making strategies for yourself. Now, of course, we have different movements. I don't know if any of you have probably seen or not, something like the Zeitgeist movement. There are different movements like this which are calling for something called a resource-based commodity, where we leave money altogether. And I don't have necessary, of course a resource-based commodity would work, but it's based on a global system, which we're actually not there yet. So the reason I'm giving you these numbers and I'm going through this, how the bank works, how this works, how that works, is not, again, to scare you. It is not to piss you off. It is just to make you aware of the system that we're working within so that you can start taking steps and make plans for yourself to protect yourself. Now, this is part, I guess, 3 in the series of where we are now. And I think this will probably conclude it. I'll probably do a concluding video. I was going to do something on religion. I may in the future, but I'm not going to right now. But the main reason I'm giving you all this is to show you the system and essentially the matrix that we live in. It is never been by or for the people, and this doesn't just include governments. This also includes the economy, the financial system, money, the way it's created. Banks and central banks have a license to print money, which they've pretty much always had. At one point in the States, they had a gold-backed currency. Of course, that's gone. And each one of these 4 countries that we're talking about works on what we call fiat currency, which is essentially paper notes, which are IOUs, which are based on nothing. And if we stop borrowing, well, the entire economy will implode. There's no other way for it to continue but to continue borrowing and to continue raising the national debt. We look at, I was a bit surprised when I saw little Canada there with $1 trillion in debt. It's a milestone they've just crossed, and they're talking about how, different ways to lower that. But if you actually look at the way the system works and the way banking works, the way central banks work and the way governments work, which they're always deficit spending, which means they're always spending more. I looked at Canada because it just reached over $1 trillion. Their deficit in the budget for this year alone is $20 billion. Now, if you look at taxes that we pay, a large portion, a pretty large portion of the taxes that we pay is actually just going to pay the interest on the national debt. So, again, the main reason I'm going through these steps, government, media, and now banking, is to show you that I'm essentially trying to lead you up to sort of an awakening into the fact that the third dimension, the matrix and the systems that we've built, have no choice but to eventually implode and collapse. And that's why there's a large group of us. In fact, like I said, it's probably close now to about 1/3 of the world, which is looking at ascension, which is looking at actually leaving this 3rd dimension and ascending into the 5th dimension, which is quite a concept, and I'm going to actually get to that in the next video. But for now, be aware that money, all of the money in our money supply, all the money in the entire economy has been made up out of thin air by the banks. It is all interest-bearing, and there is no choice but to continue raising the debt and to continue borrowing, or else the entire economy would implode. Now, of course, we're going to continue borrowing and we're going to continue raising the debt ceiling, but who's buying the debt? And at a certain point, it will implode. And the last thing I'd want you to do is to be caught off guard and with your pants down and really in complete shock at how the system could do that. So it is important, I find, that every single person knows how the economy works, how the system works, and that it's not really built or designed to work in your favor. It's designed to work in the favor of the hands of the few, and to start thinking about different strategies to protect yourself. And that is section 1 of this opening section for my channel, which is where are we now? And now we're going to move into section number 2, which is where we're going and where we can go if we choose. So again, it's with great love that I bring this to you. I'm not bringing it to you to scare you in any way. Obviously, right now everything is still, still copacetic, as they say. economies are still running, but it's important to know that at a certain point it will implode, and in this way you can start to protect yourself. And I'm also bringing this to you to sort of shake you awake to the fact that the matrix and the systems that we are living in were never built for us. They're not built for us. They will never be built for us. And it's time for us to start thinking about other solutions and working together instead of working to enrich those who, again, are essentially, I mean, they have a license to print money. I mean, that's probably a pretty good life to have. I probably wouldn't mind it. But again, it has nothing to do, or it's totally against universal law and the law of one. And just based on universal law and mathematics, there is no choice but for the system to eventually implode. So that will conclude. I'll probably do a concluding video on section 1 of where we are now. And then we're going to move in now to where can we go, what are our options, and my suggestion, of course, is to actually start looking at ascension and to join us in the ascension timeline, which if you're new to all these concepts, if I'm just bringing this to you for the first time, is going to be quite a foreign concept. You probably aren't even familiar with the term. So we're going to start the next video. We're actually going to look at what is ascension and how we can actually get there. So I love you. I bring this to you with great respect. I'm not here to scare you, but let's now move on into some of the solutions and into some of the ways that we can not only protect ourselves, but make this world a much better place. Okay? I'll see you in the next video.